So, welcome to tonight's double feature, which is a presentation by Catie Newell about her recent work, which is part, as you can see, of the School of Architecture's lecture series, which will be followed by a reception, as Ellen has already advertised, celebrating the opening of an exhibition of her work in the Stubbins Gallery. As many of you may already know, that when this building was constructed back in the 50s, the space that now holds the Stubbins Gallery directly above us was designed to serve as the college gallery. And this archival view shows the MoMA show Family of Man when it was being exhibited in the gallery sometime in the late 50s. Of course, over the years, institutions and buildings adapt, and in subsequent times, it's seen use as office space, as studio space, as storage, various sorts of things. So we're very happy that we now have the opportunity to bring it back online and as close as one can to the original intent of the space. For this, a few thanks are in order. Right off the bat, first to Dean French for bringing the college exhibition series to life, to Liz Punch from Campus Facilities, because she was the project manager for the renovations and was the one who made sure that the things who needed to get done got done. To Brian Croy, who's our college facilities manager, who's consistently helpful in matters great and small, and to the staff of the Dean's office. Some of you may also know, and many others may suspect, the Stubbins Gallery is actually named after Hugh Stubbins, who was an illustrious alumni of Georgia Tech back in the 30s and has been a friend of Georgia Tech for many, many years. And some of you may also know he's responsible for Citicorp, one of the more elegant high-rises in New York. And for for your viewing pleasure, I included a couple vintage drawings of that project. We're particularly delighted to inaugurate this freshly decorated, renovated, that was a really bad slip, and newly established series of exhibitions with the work of a highly accomplished alumna, Catie Newell. And I'll tell you more about her in just a moment. But it doesn't stop there. We have an exciting array of exhibitions to follow for this coming academic year. Immediately following Catie's exhibition is Daniel Berlaken and a number of his students went to South Africa and were involved in this really exciting design build project there. They're going to have quite an interesting exhibition up in the gallery of some of the work that they've done, full-scale pieces, things like that. We're hoping they are not going to knock down the building with the weight of all of that. But nota bene, it's the same night as the lecture of Dorte Mandrup, and so that's two for the price of one. An excellent lecture and a magnificent exhibition. Following her, we have, following them, in the spring we've got actually 6 shows from a number of the academic units within the college. The first one is a wearable electronics show from the School of Industrial Design. This show has been traveling around. I think it's in Singapore right now. It's got a lot of interesting aspects to it. After that, Cat's Cradle, which is an architecture show. 3 of our very recent graduates, Maria, Ekram, and Hijan, went to the RCR's urban laboratory, summer laboratory of architecture and landscape. I should read, I'd be better off. And so that's a threefer because Studio Mumbai was involved, so we can have some of their work there. RCR, who's an international practice that have made it a point to be local, and then 3 of our recent grads. So that's going to be a really fun show. From City Planning, Perry Yang is working on a show of energy resilient urban design. Lane Duncan and Harris Dimitropoulos from the School of Architecture on drawing from nature. You may have already heard some about that, those of you who've been in one of the Friday lectures with Lane. Very exciting. And then chairs, which is always a crowd pleaser coming from the School of Industrial Design. And then at the end of the semester and moving into the summer, the library and the archives are putting together an exhibition that is on the occasion of the AIA National Convention, which is here. So we've really got a full panoply of exciting exhibitions for you right off the bat. Back to Catie. She is, as advertised, an alum of Georgia Tech. I confirmed the urban legend that she started in aerospace engineering because it was like too good a story given how you can see how her work has moved. But yes, indeed, she did start in aerospace engineering, came to architecture via ID, and earned her Bachelor of Science in Architecture here in 2003. She moved from there to Rice University, where she got her master's in 2006, immediately won the first SOM traveling fellowship in architecture, design, and urban design with a project entitled Weather Permitting. Before joining the faculty at the University of Michigan, she also worked with Office Da in Boston and is now the founding principal of Alibi Studio in Detroit. In 2011, she won the Prize Best Use of Urban Space Juried Award, as well as the Architectural League Prize for Young Architects and Designers. More recently, and this is really popping it up to the next level, she's exhibited her work at the 2012 Venice Biennale, and then even more recently, she won the Rome Prize and spent last year in a residency at the American Academy in Rome. She's now a fellow of the American Academy in Rome. Her practice is remarkable, however, not just for the notice and awards that it's received, or even for its beauty and strength, but also because it describes and explores a particularly engaging and relevant way of working, one that we're very keen to be able to put into the view of our students and into others in the academic and professional and design communities. Her work is posited around a braided set of inquiries involving a number of scales, disciplines, and discourses. Key among these, and I think you'll see as she moves through her work, the relationship between making and intervening. Before I invite Catie to the lectern, I just have 3 small items. Now's a good time to turn off your cell phones. Second, when we go upstairs for the reception, please be aware that food and drink are not permitted in the gallery proper. You'll have to relinquish your refreshments as you go in, and then you can collect them back as you go back out, and hopefully no one will tinker with them. And then third, the work in the gallery is extremely delicate and fragile, and some of it is wicked sharp, so don't touch. Don't touch at all. And then also be very wary about things like backpacks, purses, coats, stuff like that, because they could swing around and wreak havoc. And on that dangerous note, it's really a great pleasure to welcome someone that we've been watching from afar and from near over the past decade to the podium.
I'm not sure. I think I move around so much for the microphones, but I'm not entirely exactly sure how to start because I'm so thankful and honored to be here, and I actually feel I'm sort of misbehaving being up in the podium when I'm used to all of my memories being in the seats that are down here. So this is a new view for me of this room. And I have some thank yous, of course. I want to thank Mark Cottle for instigating this exhibition and all the conversations that we've had, putting it together via email, in person, and I think even continuing now that the work is freshly hung. The students who provided a hand to help us with the work done, particularly Karen, Alston, as superheroes at very key moments. It's also important for me to thank just the collaborators I've had across the years, as well as anyone who's been an Alibi Studio before and not be noticed it goes through the work. And then I owe an enormous thanks to Joe Proper, who's here tonight. He is a hero among contractors, one of my best friends, and he's has a hand in a lot of this work, but in particular should be thanked for his ability to always pull off the impossible, and the kind of physical reality of what you'll see upstairs tonight could not be done without him. So tonight I want to talk about the work that's in the exhibit after Curfew. And it's the work that's spanned over the last 5 years. And I'd say, so you'll see 12 projects, and it's a way of also thinking and reflecting that I've been pretty busy, and I think it comes from, as Mark was talking about in terms of a source of making, realizing that making and doing installation and material research has become my way of communicating with the world. It's sort of my my way of researching and my way of actually figuring things out. And so for me, it's sort of my ability to just be part of our spaces, the architectural discourse, and just the community in general. And so through all this, maybe just as a little precursor of my work, so Mark mentioned I have a firm, Alibi Studio, and a lot of our work has to do with kind of researching a city through making, and a lot of interest in materials, material effects, and kind of a high sort of focus on spaces that are already existing. So I'd say that it's really sort of responsive work, and work that's meant to be in communication with the space more so than designing necessarily from something entirely new or a blank slate. And the stuff I'm going to talk about after Curfew, I just, as another precursor to the exhibit, I think tonight I'm going to share maybe what you won't see. A lot of my work is very site-specific, really attuned to conditions of light and material effects, and things that I honestly feel like in their final production can't necessarily be untied from their site. And so things are placed in a way, the work upstairs is shown chronologically, and in a way I feel like they've brought all of the pieces of the sites and the stories together, but they're hung out of their time and out of their place, and they sit there to kind of have new conversations, but also in a way to sort of communicate what was going on at that moment, or even the sort of nimble and agile way of working with that time and those materials. So when I go through the work tonight, I'm going to break the chronological order. I'm actually going to speak more typologically as a way to draw those connections that can't happen as directly or happen in a different way than what will happen upstairs. And also maybe as a way to key in some of the things that were happening with the sites, particular time or current events that these pieces were made by or through and of, as well as maybe to link together pieces that are not in proximity to each other upstairs, but in proximity to each other in kind of my way of thinking. And then the work upstairs can sort of be celebrated as a different conversation, knowing as you see these things out of order from the way I'll talk about them tonight, sort of understanding that these are the things I'm constantly in conversation with, and how one may have led to affect the other, being in a different order than how I'm going to talk tonight. So the first set I want to talk about actually is a series that I refer to as the Once Resident series, and this is actually a set of installations that for me is, they're all in former domestic spaces, so they were once a residence, and they all respond very particularly to a location, but also try to have a conversation that's more ubiquitous about what might be happening in the city they're located in. So the domestic is chosen as a way to kind of reference and call back to the issues of the housing typologies, but also things that are happening strangely in what's happening. And all four of these works, three of them in Detroit, which is where my practice is and where I live, and one of them is in Flint, and I think you'll see how that laces together the importance of these works. So the first one is called weatherizing, and to explain it very briefly, weatherizing in a way can be seen as kind of expanding out on a sort of a new type of window, particularly in the city of Detroit, where there's a lot of, particularly also at this time, but even now, a lot of boarded up spaces, spaces boarded up, which have in turn this effect of having very dark interiors, but also bring up issues of privacy and security. And so I was interested in actually reconsidering this flat pane window, and also trying to see if there was a way, not even necessarily solving any of the issues or problems, but seeing if there's a way to rediscover conditions of the interior and the exterior through the work. And so in a much longer story, there was, in 2019, there was a handful of us that were fellows at the University of Michigan that acquired a house in Detroit as a way that we could all actually use some of our full-scale research on. And working through that house, boarding it up, at the time I was also working in glass, which is something you'll see comment upstairs, and I'll talk about a little bit more. First requirement and instinct to board up the house entirely. And in doing so, wanting to also think about that moment where the barrier of the interior and the exterior are somehow being lost in this boarded up condition. For whatever reason, wanted to actually sort of act as a puncture into that, and ended up putting glass tubes literally through the walls of the house. And they, of course, worked like a giant optical fiber. This is a dark side of a boarded up house. During daytime, you can see the glow coming in. As my friends started to cut up the house in different ways, that let too much light into the space, so I moved to the garage. And Detroit actually has a sort of removed garage typology, so I was able to actually have a space where I could continue to study basically the captured darkness and to reconsider the window. So this window in this space actually became really important to my work. And what I ended up doing on kind of the first interest was I built up the space and actually had a moment, and I'll talk about this later for another project, trying to get the space as dark as possible, and then trying to have that contrast between the boarded up dark volume and the constantly changing weather that happens outside of Michigan. And it's at that moment that I actually decided to retake the surface area of the original house, combined with these tube materials tests that I was doing, and in essence take that surface area and try to spread it out differently over the volume. And so if you were to cut the tubes that I was working with and be able to condense them back together, they would fit back into that original window. And I started to work very carefully around the architectural details, making the door, the window, the roof peak of the original house, and in essence just started to insert these tubes back in, trying to maintain a careful delicacy between how much light it was letting in, this sort of amazing glow that I was in a way very unexpected, and the kind of remaining dark volume that was still in the garage. And so as I added more and more and let more and more light in, basically what happens is, in essence, the window becomes volumized. It becomes part of that space. And something, too, where there was a little bit more of a bodily experience. Some of the choices were made to have moments, for instance, these pieces would come out just as far, so if you opened up the door swing, you would feel like you were going to break one of the tubes. And so trying to also aggregate a little bit of a response into human occupation of the spaces as well. And so this actually shows the space. This is a daytime photo. This is nearly complete of the installation. And again, the same surface area, holes cut as the original window, but now something in the volume. And the tubes were hollow, and so they're also letting in air and precipitation. And so it's definitely not something operating as a practical window, but something instead that I think can instigate other conversations. I also should note that I was really interested, particularly because even through this house and conditions in Detroit, there's a lot of electrical theft, the stealing of copper wire. I was interested in figuring out if there was a way that this garage could remain off the grid at all times too, and service this relationship to the exterior light and the interior darkness at 24/7. And so embedded into the walls also was a series of LEDs that were charged by the solar panels on the roof by day, and at night would glow as well. So that basically there's kind of a constant glow happening in the garage at all times based on the weather effect from the exterior and the lighting effect, and then a little bit of a relationship to not continuously going through the fact of losing our electricity to the copper theft. Here's a detail showing just the tubes that were bent and flared and moved in different directions, a lot towards the happenstance of knowing that I had no control over the sort of wind direction, the type of weather that was coming through, and so it was more of actually the chance that one of these tubes would be aligned with that at any moment. So there was an audio condition to the project as well, that with the wind grazing, or even better with it raining outside, that would move across the tubes and move into the space differently. And of course, also a surprise for me ended up being the shadow condition that would happen. And that actually did relate into how and where the tubes ended up being placed. Knowing that every day I was getting this beautiful, basically drawing that was constantly changing across the front, that in the bright light, which was common for the winter time when this was being made, the tubes were almost impossible to see, and the shadow sort of took over that condition. And then here it is at night, giving off that kind of reflection, and I really, I like this picture. I try to actually, you'll see it as I go through, I try to actually have a few photographs that, in essence, allow to have this conversation of the material narrative that's going on, to, as a way to share the reading of this. For me, it's really important that the electrical lines are in the background. This place is completely off the grid, and the sort of experience of having this weatherizing installation at the nighttime as well as kind of capturing the daytime at the same time. So another once residency project, in a way, if weatherizing was the sort of dark room to then add light, salvage landscape can also be read in a way of almost adding darkness to a space. But it's carried with itself. This is a moment where the material work and the spatial intervention is also trying to make something out of a kind of dire circumstance, and another issue that's happening in cities. So salvage landscape is actually the curation of a demolishing of an arson home in Detroit. And it's sort of the simultaneous disassembling of an arson house and the reassembling of a new room that in a way was only possible because the house was ever set on fire, and also really keyed into some of the material realities of what charred wood can and can't do, and again working with that domestic technology. So in Detroit we have a lot of arsons, and I think it's something that actually carries a very strong visceral weight. And so salvage landscape wanted to have a way to deal, or in a way starts to become a substrate to talk about these circumstances, but of course wasn't something where we set the fire, nor something where we're trying to stop any of the fires, but for me it becomes something where I can't see any arson without thinking about salvage landscape and the reverse as well, so hopefully that'll come through as I walk you through the process of making it. But this is the site and the palette and the formwork for the project. Two historical homes that were the last two historical homes left in the front yard of our infamous train station. We call these, if I mention it again, affectionately from the street, we call these lefty and righty, and salvage is made out of lefty. And so the kind of first action on the house was in a way just sort of accepting the environment that it was, but starting to have an instinct and an interest of knowing the fact that this once was a residence. It's gone through excessive material damage. And in doing that, there's also this material reality that's changing the conditions of everything that's native to the house, but is still remaining within that space. And so, without knowing what was going to happen, I began salvaging the wood. And basically taking the char, looking at the char, enjoying it for its sort of bulbous texture. It's very shiny. It becomes much more lightweight when it has been burned. And really just trying to slowly take apart the house. And so this literally became the studio for Alibi Studio, and became the space that we would work. There was moments in sort of taking apart the house where things like the second story would fall to the first story, and I want you to remember that when I talk about the next project too. But basically watching a house recompose itself while taking it apart is what led to finally beginning to understand the volumes and the runes that are made in different ways, and maybe how to start putting it back together. So we reached a moment in the demolition where the house looks like this perfect section cut. Most of the burn was the epicenter was the foreground, so that half of the house is now splayed out in the sort of salvaging that we were doing. So while I was salvaging wood, others were coming by and taking the metals and the tiles and that sort of thing. And when that became the clean section cut, it was at that moment that it became apparent to literally shove that wood back into the space and allow the house to be the palette and the formwork to make a new room that was only possible in this space, and condensing the house back into itself. This jumps ahead several. It took us maybe 28 days to put this together. But so what happened is, another thing of note is the house was saved, which isn't meaning the fire department showed up, which isn't the condition for all the homes by far in what's happening in Detroit. And so what you're actually seeing is most of the wood was not, of course, burnt all the way through. And so we could do a clean cut on the end of the wood and still have a raw exposure of the wood. And then a lot of what you're seeing in the depths here is actually the char. So some of it's shadow in the image, of course, but most of the blacks that you're seeing on the screen is the kind of thickness of the char, but definitely the impure geometries stacked. So what happens now, so you guys are basically in the backyard, looking forward, there's a clean cut that matches with that section cut of the demolished house, and then you literally can start to move through the piece, and you're moving through half of the house ends now horizontally. So you move up, this is looking back on through, you pass through this. This is going back into that passage, turn through and around the outside, and what you get on the other side is this. And this is actually the same wood, so because of the burn and it becoming much lighter, these could be very long cantilevers. I think our longest cantilever, or our longest piece, I believe, was 14 feet. But it's also interesting to note that these were things now, because of their char and their lightness, that I could hold and be able to be putting them in place, and that could maintain a really strong cantilever that I think, in the more kind of processed lumber that is unburnt would not be able to handle this kind of cantilevering. And so this actually also, true to the space and true to the kind of char, added a lot of darkness back into the house in a way. And so as you can imagine, this is capping off the lower floor and shutting back into the space. And we had no electricity on site. Everything was gas-powered tools and a little bit of stolen electricity from neighbors for a few tools. And we had to stop every night at sunset, basically, because it became too dark to work. And so this is the moment, and thankfully, in an interesting way, in October in Detroit, the way this lefty was facing, the sun was coming right on the front door. And so it would actually come through. This was an adjustment on site. It would come through and graze what we were building. And so this is actually a little bit of how we ended up deciding to make this piece and this turn, was to allow this grazing to happen where the char actually becomes gold. Surprisingly, for a few moments. And Salvage Landscape in this setup opened on October 30th, which in Detroit is Devil's Night. And so, Devil's Night is a night notorious for arson. And so in a way, this project was allowed, became existent on a night that otherwise most of us are keeping watch and diligence to make sure things aren't being burnt down. And it's important to note the section cut and the site. This is again where I honestly think the project is in essence and held as a space over the need of all of lefty and righty in this whole zone. And so actually as we move forward, the house, the owner wanted to demolish the house as much as possible. The formwork of this space became removed because we continued to demolish the house. And so what emerged, of course, out of its mold, which was the house, is now this dense cube of what is Salvage Landscape. So this is its sort of next stage, and keyed into the details of moments that we particularly we can never see. Where, for instance, these are the roof panes because the trusses, or the roof panels, the trusses wouldn't allow for the fire to go through. So you have these stripes that for us became what we knew would be the exterior when we basically took it out of its formwork. So it had a new life at that point. Strange things happen and it moves. Mark had mentioned this, but it went over to Grand Rapids. The Grand Rapids Art Museum wanted it for a show and a competition. So we moved it over. Me and Joe Cropper figured out how to move it over. And delivered it by night. So we took it out of its original house, delivered it to this very modern, clean courtyard space, unpackaged it. They immediately put police barricades around it, deemed it dangerous, and then it won best use of urban space. So I think there's a lot of stories kind of embedded in that. And Salvage then had this moment of returning. And basically returning now to become something that can discuss the massing of the city. There's many more stories, and for time tonight, I will remove talking through all of them, but we replaced Salvage a few doors down from the original house. We put it on this space called the Driveway to Nowhere, which was formerly where our house was, in hopes that we actually could use this half of this house and its transposition to make a new massing in the historic district that was already gone. And so Salvage sat there next to its neighbors, directly aligned with the original homes, and sort of became another piece in that neighborhood until, of course, the original house got hit by arson again. And so there's further conversations that kind of go on with the life of Salvage and the life of the house. And this is another one of those closer images in terms of just the conversations about the massing and the massing that we're using. And then the kind of embedded understanding that this really is half of the house, otherwise being lost both to arson and the kind of demolishing of our spaces. So salvage led then to second story. So salvage had a lot to do about demolishing a house. Second story is actually material work that has to do with trying to prevent a demolition, in fact. So second story, to describe it easily, is the sort of skimming and ghosting of a historic home in Flint, Michigan, that's then relocated and given new occupations for a space that was otherwise under threat to be torn down. So there's a strange duplex of a historic space, duplex funeral home, in fact, in Flint, that the owners, having seen salvage landscape, contacted me and mentioned that the city was asking them to tear down the space. They wanted to keep it, and they needed me for two things. One was to just tell them how bad the roof was, and that the puddles on the second floor were not good for them. And the second one was they were trying to figure out was there a way to get, in essence, good press for the space to sort of stall the fact that the city wanted to tear it down. And so at the same time, I had commissioned a gallery in Chicago that was white walls. I had no idea what to do. And so I actually became really interested in figuring out how to use this space to bring those volumes of something under a threat of loss to another location, and to maybe instigate the conversation about the loss of this house, the ghosting of that, and sort of the erasure of that as well. So second story is made out of acrylic rods that were chosen for their transparency and also their ability to become very attenuated. But the transparency allowed me to basically kind of provide a new skin to the interior, basically a tracing of the interior and the exterior, without taking the texture, without taking the color, but instead really focusing on the form and that massing. So skin the inside and the outside, and then move that piece to Chicago. And what I have to mention is the moving of it was also in the intention of getting new types of occupations that wouldn't have existed otherwise. And so you can imagine if you do the interior and the exterior, what you have left, of course, is the wall thickness. And that now is a void. I was interested in moving it imperfectly, so that void, as well as some other things, could become new spaces that weren't actually something we could physically inhabit in the original house. And so if you can imagine taking the two skins and then sort of spreading them apart and they're moving, you open up that wall. And so there's three new occupations in second story. There's a wall image that I'm sure will pop up soon. I just want to show the windowsill in that shift gets stretched out. So it became a space we call the sillway, became a new space. And then the other occupation, so here's the wall that you can get into. Opened it up enough that this literally became a new space in that void. And then the last occupation, of course, is this was a portion of the second story. Part of the name of the project as well, but also part of the intention behind it, was to bring part of that second story down to a first story and allow you that sort of circumnavigation that you can't do because something's up in the air. And so we were very particular that also nothing of the installation touched the ground. So only shadows and people in the gallery with things on the floor. Everything else is suspended from above. And so it gets this soft grazing as well as a sort of mystery atmosphere of the ghosting. And thankfully the building survived and is actually turned into a really great arts space. The project, however, the original gallery that it was in, through sort of roof leak problems and odor arguments, got evicted. And this was moments before I was actually going, when Mark mentioned the Venice Biennale. A few days before I was going to the Venice Biennale to install, I got word that I had maybe 20 days to take the second story down. But I really only had about 2 days given the airplane flights. And so second story came down sort of quickly and aggressively. And in doing so, I had to put it into storage. And I'm breaking the pieces, I'm putting them in storage, and you'll see upstairs the fragility of the piece and other issues about how much it can fit through a door or not. But in putting it away into storage, I sort of had this moment. This is again where the kind of material research could talk about the city. I was literally putting it into one of these generic public storage spaces and feeling that kind of loss of putting a house into storage, or the loss of that original Spencer funeral home in storage. And so second story wasn't going to survive another full installation, so we reinstalled it inside the storage space and kind of proceeded to have another moment opening for it in that space before now it's in the pieces, few of which you'll see upstairs. And the last one of the Once Resident series I want to talk about is Unlit. Unlit was what Alibi Studio showed at the Venice Biennale, and is actually a chance. David Chipperfield was the curator that year. He actually asked the 5 of us, if you remember talking about the house for weatherizing, to revisit our projects. And so I actually got a chance to go back to the work that I had done for that original garage. And in a way, struggle with the idea of how was I going to bring that effort of that darkness from Detroit to Venice. And after a lot of work, it came through with this project Unlit. And Unlit for me is that revisiting back to this moment. It goes back to talking about boarding up a space. It goes back to wanting to cover all those light leaks. So for me, the installation of Unlit is actually the movement of the volume through moving all of the efforts of making those light leaks. And so Unlit's made of wood, which is the common material that is used to board up the windows. But it's cut in very, very delicate structures, one of them especially not to touch upstairs. And it's done in a way that it's basically tracing the original volume, but doing so by tracing light leaks that would exist in the structures. And also, I just want to point out, it's done in a thinness knowing that the humidity of Venice would actually allow the piece to curl. And so I wanted there to be a conversation between this kind of movement from Detroit to Venice and the struggles that go with the kind of commentary of that city and it on show as an exhibition, and dealing with the changes of humidity and pressure and even occupation. Where in Detroit, I'm the only person that's occupying this space. In Venice, of course, it's getting quite the movement through. So the longer the Biennale went, the more the humidity affected the wood, the more kind of wrinkling it went through, and the more occupants in the space the same way. And so that was the kind of material work to register that sort of difference. And I think, interestingly enough, also, truth to the kind of name Unlit, the project is really difficult to photograph, and could only really best be photographed if everything else around it was lit instead of that. And so this, you'll start to see the themes of kind of darkness and illumination coming through, but I think this is a key project to remember when I talk about the last series of works. And one last one that I just want to add, because it's upstairs, Diptic is actually a piece of work that was made for the exhibition that went along with the Architecture Week Prize of 2011. And that prize entails doing an exhibition of the work that you've done, but doing something that in a way hopefully curates your ways of working and perhaps the projects that you're showing. And so for me, Diptic was actually hosting photographs of salvage landscape and weatherizing as the 2 projects I had done before that show. Second Story was being done concurrently. And so what was being shown was actually trying to figure out how to have a conversation of those 2 projects in a wall, in a clean gallery, and to get more material research out of it at the same time. So Diptic's actually an armature for photographs, but also an armature that hopefully is evoking a little bit of that working with subtleties of the site, and also working with kind of existing conditions or material realities. And so it's metal, it's steel, it's cut so that it can be pulled and frayed. And on one side, we very particularly matched the exact light of the existing gallery that it would be in, and on the other side, we allowed it to have its rust exposed, knowing that the kind of 2 reverse sides, pushing and pulling and bending the 2 would start to actually have a different visual effect. And so you'll see it upstairs is actually hanging with no photographs. So you can see it for sort of its own material life. But you'll see it, interestingly enough, upstairs it has a different relationship to where here the whites compounded on one another would allow the work to sort of disappear, also being a game of shadows. Upstairs, I think it's interesting to look at it from the rough side and the painted side, as well as acknowledging the sort of section and the detailing that fits the wall and the photos. So you'll be able to see how that works. And this is actually the full installation of the photographs, much of which you've already seen earlier, and then how it sat on the wall, and of course would get the day. Basically over here in the actual space is an enormous window that would pass across Diptic all during the day, and the cast of lights were important above to get the shadows. And this one is very dangerous. I'm going to shift now to another set of works. Distortion themed for these sets. This is actually now, I'm going to talk about my glass work, which I do with my good friend and colleague, Wes McGee at the University of Michigan, who I know is coming November 21st. He's a member of Matter Design. so he'll be here lecturing as well. Wes and I have done a lot of glass work together that generally has started with a little bit of a curiosity and sort of an interest in trying to push windows out of just being flat plain glass. It's a lot in the interest of how the material of glass actually works, but also wondering where we can push the effects of the material in terms of illumination, but also the effects, and you'll see this played out upstairs, in terms of stressing it maybe to the moment of it crystallizing and no longer being glass, or being pulled so thin that it's sort of consistently on the verge of breaking. So we started with actually glass cast, which for us was a big project. In one part, designing a kiln that would allow us to do work in catenary slumping. And so the kiln actually operates as a pin mold kiln. And what this would allow us to do is to get rid of hard formwork. We're not the only ones to be using pin molds or pin mold kilns. But for us, we actually began to push it into catenary slumping. So the idea is we would begin to do work. These were earlier studies where we were able to try to get curvatures that we knew we could control for things like mullions or other connections using all of the other fabrication equipment, but couldn't necessarily always get glass to push as far in terms of the difficult curvatures. So we were really after complex curvature and being able to literally know where our edges or our fasteners would end up being, but without making a hard mold with every single project. So we developed a system of actually catenary slumping, which has to do with putting key points that we know how to control in the kiln and allowing the heat and temperature tests that we do to be able to imply and affect the curvatures that we're getting. So the first installation we made with that is glass cast. And basically glass cast is a series of catenary slump panes that add up together to basically form overall forms. And so for us, each piece is slumped individually, and we're able to control the points and geometries knowing how they add together in hopes of moving it forward to another project. And I should also note, so you're seeing it in this one, glass cast, I believe it's my next. Glass cast for us was also that spatial recognition of working with glass, but we started to also realize other strange light effects that were happening. So simultaneously, while we were working with the kiln, we were also interested in glass blowing, because again, it's back to the base of this amazing material. And so I want to also mention at the same time we were doing these work, and you'll see them upstairs, called diffuse globes. And diffuse globes relies on the ability of making perfect blanks. So similar to our pane, starting with a perfect flat piece, we would work with diffuse globes, making perfect spheres to do light fixtures, but then actually end up distorting them, aggressively working with them to change the volume either inward or outward, knowing that if we were able to fill the interior, and you'll see this, we fill the interior with a really fine particulate matter, adding a light bulb back into the interior, what happens is the particulate matter diffuses the light. So if you push closer to that matter, there's less of material to diffuse that light. And so anywhere that we push aggressively in is where the light can escape out. And so for us, this was a matter of designing lights where we could control where the light's coming out of the original blank. So we have uppers and lowers, and a different array of patterns for us. So it was more of actually working with some of the tools we were developing to manipulate glass, and then trying to take it as well into conditions of light and affecting the rest of the space that's in. And then we came back to glass cast. Glass cast actually picked back up when somebody asked us to do a piece in a Nature's Medley Hall is what it was called, I believe. Somebody asked us to do a piece in an abandoned natural history museum. We were conveniently given the room that was the butterfly room. And so there was all these specimens around. There was these strange leftover fake plants, real plants, old butterflies. And we pushed glass cast back in there under the hunch that we were being able to start to talk about different reflections that were happening in the glass. And so one thing we noted when we were making the glass cast pieces was when we were in the fabrications lab at Michigan and would pull a pane of glass out of the kiln, the fluorescent lights above in the fab lab would actually make these amazing stripes on the piece. It's basically like the zebra stripes of looking at the curves of a car. And so we wanted to actually work with that. So specimen became something in terms of working in this room, also to curate the lights that it would get, so that we knew that we would get this this reflection down. And so really important to us was just to have a simple pattern above, knowing we have complex curvatures below. And so we'd start to get these effects. And so this was the moment where, in fact, our effects were what were becoming before the formal conditions of the material. And so this is a view down one of the faces. And all of this made simply from the 18 fluorescent lights that we had above. And then they're seeing double reflections because there's 2 layers. And I should also note, something that became a surprise for us, in fact, was there were still showcases in the room that it was in. And so all of a sudden, what we also didn't realize we would get is not only the reflections of our fluorescent lighting, but the things of, there are multiple specimens in the room, basically reflecting off of all the display cases of the original piece. So this actually became something leading us further down the line, wanting to look at the material effects of glass and its capability, of course, of reflecting light, but also seeing through it, which really instigated the next set of projects, which is called Displace. Displace is a follow-up to the glass work, but this time, wanting to work with that reflectivity, we added in for ourselves investigations into mirroring the glass. And so the mirroring for us allowed us to really talk about reflectivity in multiple ways. And the interesting things that come with that, of course, and that we found fascinating, when you mirror something, there's a couple of different conditions that end up being crucial to that work. One, of course, is that you have this object that's really taking on the characteristic of everything around it. Its texture is extremely smooth. Well, assuming you're mirroring something that's really smooth. It's also, it's smooth and shiny, but it, in essence, has the color of everything around it. Or it reflects oddly and makes smooth or shiny that material or reflection around it as well. You also, for us, we were still pushing glass and what it could do. And so Displace allowed us to really push the material and then the kind of material effects or the immaterial effects. So we started to work with a system of mirroring, trying to actually work along the line where you could go from what would be the opacity of mirroring down to seeing through the glass, so sort of degrees of transparency along the reflection. And that was simply working, or not simply at all, that was working with processes of tinning and working with silver nitrate and trying to actually learn, especially with the complex geometries we were pushing simultaneously, how to actually allow that to be part of the pieces. While still now trying to get formwork that maybe, because we were focusing on the reflection, didn't necessarily have to be glass that had to do all the work in terms of holding itself up or being entirely stable or being something that wasn't about to break after its use. So we started to make these twins, and you'll see 2 twins upstairs, but they're done with a particular process that I'll mention in a second too. Basically, an interest here for us was again how you start with those flat blanks in a kiln, and then slumping it. But this time, actually, we did an installation that was either done on floors or tables. This time, actually, the interest was allowing the pieces to hit the bed of the kiln, but developing different original blanks that, as they hit the kiln, they would fold, so they would get flat pieces, or something basically that was stable on its own. But then also learning more about our kiln by trying to do symmetrical opposites every time, just seeing how close and far they would get to being the same mirrored, really mirrored formally shape. And so we actually use the pieces in Displace to sort of push the reflectivity as much as possible. We wanted to use the pieces in the mirroring to also make strange, obscure worlds or records of the spaces we are around the reflection. So this is a reflection in a very kind of simple room of the window that's in that space. And this is actually looking through one of our pieces and being reflected at the same time. And I should point out, so there's a series of films upstairs. One of the films is actually a work that we did off of the pieces for Displace. And so it's the one called Semblance. And basically that film is made entirely by filming the reflection or filming through the glass. And so you'll see moments where it's very complex layering. It's not at all video editing. It's complex because at that time you're seeing a reflection and through the space. So that's an interesting one to watch for with that. And here's a still from that. I should mention, because I don't think I have any images of that, or maybe I do. The one upstairs is actually not going to look as chrome as some of these mirrorings, but instead is a result of another thing that we were working with. I'm not sure if I have any images, but there's a moment when glass starts to, well, glass is amorphous. So if it starts to crystallize, it's actually no longer glass. It's called vitrification. Vitrification meaning becoming glass. Vitrification meaning no longer becoming glass. So the one you'll see upstairs, in a way, after it's mirrored, maybe looks a little bit more like aluminum. But if you look very closely, without getting too close, you'll see it actually starting to crystallize, and it looks like the glass has gone through a lot of stress. So in fact, it's not going to look. Here's an image of one of them. It doesn't help you at all. It's out of focus. But it's a different type of mirroring than the ones that you'll see here. And that one was just simply which one we brought and sort of the safety of hanging the one that we brought. Again, you can see the relationship to specimen and the sort of lighting effects that we had. And in this case, we were making tables with lights and really trying to push now the reflection of the mirror. This is a moment where you're seeing through the mirroring because it's not, in essence, a full opaque of the mirroring. And this is a moment where you're actually seeing the kind of strong reflection that's happening in a space that's more consistent in a stronger kind of tinting and mirroring that's happening. And this gives you an example of sort of when it's set in a setting, you really start to see the kind of obstruction or alteration of that world that happens by simply looking at the glass and what it's giving you as an object, and what it's kind of taking or providing as a viewpoint of the space that it's in. I also mentioned these, I don't usually lecture about this one too much, but it's upstairs because at the same time we were doing the globes, Wes and I were asked to do, lighting for this really interesting dinner series, and somehow in the twist of that, because we were working with glass, we were also asked to do the wine glasses for these dinners. And so for us, actually, became a moment where we were able to work with that sort of disruption of a formal blank. So we started with blank, sort of perfect stemless glasses, and then disrupted those with the kind of interest and instigation of actually not just changing the formwork of each glass as you could hold it or drink it, but also understanding that when there's liquid in there, you're kind of constantly changing that contour line of what you're able to drink or what comes around. So we made all of these sort of sets of water and wine glasses, none of which are the same. We made them in pairs and sort of through different techniques, but you'll see a few samples up above, but it really has a lot to do with taking the geometry, obviously taking the relationship of liquid to gravity, and then the kind of formal nuances that you can make through the sort of active heating and manipulation of the glass work. And so you'll see, if you look very carefully, the kind of the contour lines that come. And then there's a strange relationship to not ever being able to, we didn't do anything in relationship to trying to get like a perfect grip or a hand. And so it had a lot to do also, as you watch people drink through these, the hand's kind of constantly just trying to find itself on basically the topography that we've given it on the exterior, while the liquid's constantly settling on the interior topographies. And the last one that I'll also add in this sort of distortion set is a little bit of the work that I did in collaboration with two other fellows of the Academy this last year. We did this project called Found Realities, and for me this was a moment, kind of started through a whole bunch of conversations, but this was a moment actually to look, as with the wine glasses, to sort of look at smaller domestic objects and how the alteration of those can in a way also kind of alter a larger space or alter the kind of feeling or essence in that space. Again, another material research as well. So with Peter Bomnani, who is a fiction writer, and Thomas Kelly, who is also an architect, we started a work called Found Realities, where basically, and you'll see that I was doing other projects in wax, I started to accidentally make very strange spoons out of wax because of how I was working on two other pieces that I'll talk through next. And over sort of the sharing of these strange spaces or strange utensils with the fiction writer, it became a story and a conversation about trying to work with different realities of what sort of space or people or even environments may or may not need very different utensils. And so for us, we actually started, as Peter would write fictions about actually a strange archaeologist who was finding this, and basically writing the fictions of him and the civilization he was saying would use these, it would push back and forth on the utensils. And so the conversation, it's a little bit strange to not have them here too, but because the conversation has a lot to do with the alteration of the material process, but also the relationship to what environment these predict. So we were actually able, though, to set up sort of a way of presenting this work and pushing it further for all three of us by actually setting it in a kind of immersive setting where we took over an old archaeological space and basically began to set out the narrative of studying these utensils and the realization of what may or may not be this environment. And so we placed them very carefully in existing drawers throughout a room where also, and these you can see Peter's writing, I'm sorry for the Italian a little. See, Peter's writing in terms of the story of revealing the distrusted researcher who has found these objects, as well as what the objects would be used for. And so the nuances of them really get into the kind of space and environment that this would be hosted in, and the speculation of how something small really actually has that larger architectural impact. And Thomas Kelly did these amazing drawings that all had to do with him kind of taking on being that researcher, analyzing the work that I was making with strange material manipulations for its sort of formal geometries and its play in relationship to the space it was in, as well as the kind of size of the food that was being speculated. And so we put it throughout this workshop. You see these pieces, and this was in a real operating architectural or archaeological space, and the kind of sprinkling of those throughout, making a larger narrative of the whole thing. So you'll see a few of the objects upstairs. I believe there's a set of spoons that we hung that have the kind of, in hopes that they will actually call upon very different spaces than the one that they're in. And the last little segment of work that I'll show, or that I'll talk about, is the last two projects chronologically on the line in involving darkness. And the work that I was focusing on at the American Academy this last year actually was the interest that I kept seeing coming through my work about darkness and sort of the lack of illumination and what that means for spaces in sort of the kind of experience of that space as a material of reality, but also just what that means architecturally and through the existence of nighttime or dark spaces. And so I worked through two installations, both in kind of a commentary of this, and one more in a reflection of that work, and one more in the kind of use of darkness, and I'll explain the difference with those two. So the first one's Curfew, which is hanging upstairs and has a lot to do with the title of After Curfew, but Curfew actually is a very small installation that was commissioned for a gallery show while I was over there. But I have to admit that it actually pairs a lot with some of the research that I was doing. So when I first showed that, when I first got to Rome and kind of throughout the whole year, as I'm trying to figure out how to study darkness, I did a series of photographs. None of which are here, but I'll show you some of them. And really for me, so the series of photographs was called Nightly. I was trying actually to just kind of explore our spaces at night, trying to understand darkness for what it is as sort of a volume and material kind of reality or instigator. And also just to kind of, it was my way actually into a city that I didn't know. I didn't know Rome very well, and for me actually to experience it in terms of its nighttime allowed me to think about architecture differently, but also allowed me to work through that city. And so the thing though that of course kept coming back to, you think about the Once Residence projects, is I'm naturally drawn to domestic spaces. I think there's something about the commonality of them, but also their ability to be a sort of material culture about the cities and the times that they're in. And so Curfew for me, I kept coming back to sort of the record of strange illuminations, a lot of times with thresholds or windows into domestic spaces. And so Curfew actually came at this moment when I was starting to think a lot about thresholds and the difference between kind of interior darkness, public darkness, private darkness that move in between night and day, and sort of also, if you think back to weatherizing and Unlit, the kind of containment of darkness or the kind of cyclical nightfall of darkness. So Curfew, I actually kind of true to the name of curfew, meaning cover the fire. In French, it's sort of cover the fire, to kind of put out the flame. I wanted to make a project that I knew was going to be in a gallery show, a place where I had no control over the lighting, but something that actually allowed me to work through that sort of threshold and that kind of understanding of these moments when we're either forced to change our darkness or darkness changes our kind of entry or exit to a space. And so I was interested in curfews happening at nightfall, curfews kind of being that moment where you have to leave public darkness to go into private darkness and vice versa. But of course also interested in this idea of covering the flame and wanting to do do with something that literally burns away. And so Curfew, interestingly enough, and there's some candle wicks up there, but I haven't actually talked to Mark about setting this one on fire. I think that goes with the don't touch the pieces. But the Curfew sets on fire, and so actually cover the flame is that moment you put the flame out. So Curfew's actual sort of real moment is in fact that moment that you put the flame out, and it has all these smoke trails, which are in contrast to the kind of aggressive candle wicks and the wax trails that you're seeing for the rest of the piece. And so there's this one moment where it basically has a life, and it's that one moment also where things are falling from day to night, covering the flame and the sort of life of that kind of instigation. So I don't think you'll see the smoke trails upstairs tonight. But, and the last one, the last installation, it's the last one on the line upstairs, and the most recent one that I just finished in Rome in July, it's called Trespass. And Trespass, I was interested in actually being able to take a moment of doing an installation in the darkness and needing its reliance on darkness. So for me, actually, Trespass is sort of the one that's the most awkwardly out of place upstairs because it, in essence, needs darkness. It's sort of, Joe can attest to how I've been thinking that Trespasses look strange all week as we rehang it because it doesn't actually have its darkness around it, whereas some of the other projects about lighting have slipped by in their oddity, but Trespass seems to feel the most kind of missing of its original site. So Trespass, there's an aqueduct that runs under the American Academy in Rome, and it's a historical space, and it's one of the original aqueducts, but it was also one of the first ones to be cut off. And the academy was built on top of it, and the building was planned before they knew that the aqueduct was there, and then of course laying the foundations, they find this, and so it's literally under the building and sort of just kind of propped off by our foundations. So it's a strange historic space. You don't really know where it's going or leading to, but it's a dark space, and if you know where the right kind of hole in the ground is, you can get down in there. And I was interested actually also in darkness about when we see darkness and the kind of relationship we have to projecting what we think we see in darkness, or what is both actually the spatial realities, but in essence sort of becomes our fears. Like the fear of darkness is not actually fearing darkness, but fearing what we're imagining is there. So I was interested in doing an installation that implied the kind of occupation of darkness, but didn't allow you to get to that darkness. So instead, really worked with the kind of startling moment of seeing the darkness, the kind of fear of falling into it, and then understanding that each visitor to the installation would have, in essence, their own spatial experience of what they thought was in the aqueduct. Because it was historic, I was also not allowed to actually touch the aqueduct. So the installation I made, very particularly, its details were whatever I could touch that was officially the McKenmead and White building of the academy, and then would, in essence, fall into that space without, of course, not touching the aqueduct, but in essence, sort of swallowing the darkness. And so, Trespass, in a way, led you up to this hole in the ground, and then became the new ladder down to that space. So I removed the ladder that would get you to the aqueduct, and then allowed Trespass to be this piece that was dangling from above in a way you couldn't see, in sort of a catenary curve that went down into the space and faded entirely down away into the darkness. And so Trespass, you'll see, it may even be that piece right there hanging upstairs, but in essence, the thing I couldn't bring and that you can't actually keep in that tangible matter is, of course, the darkness of the rest of the aqueduct. And so I think chronologically, Trespass is also a good place to stop, but also, just a good few closing comments on the exhibit upstairs, or just the idea, because I think, the interesting thing about this exhibit, because things are, it's a timeline, but they're sort of out of their time, and they're out of their sights. It's actually a moment to be able to see the work for their material nuances, the kind of, I think if you look at the work, you'll see the things, obviously, that I'm interested in terms of really attenuating pieces, very delicate, often violent looking, and to sort of just see that work as things that I'm trying, in essence, to develop different spatial experiences or spatial atmospheres. And so I hope that as you move around the spaces, there's some films and stills of these things in their sites, and little booklets that actually pass you through these as well. But I'm actually also interested myself in experiencing a lot of the kind of conditions of seeing them as their materials alone and away from their site, but also wanting to sort of reference them as knowing that all of the decisions were made based on their site, based on their timing, and kind of based on the material manipulation that went with just constantly being keyed into that. So with that, I'm done with presenting that work. I invite you upstairs.
Yeah, let's have some questions.
I'll start. This is another question.
These questions just got picked up.
So, Katie, I really appreciate your work. I'm
Thanks.
curious to know, the photography was incredible.
Thanks.
Was that your work?
It is my work as
Because
well.
the lighting of it and the contrast is really quite remarkable.
I think that's something that plays a lot into the interest of illumination and darkness. Like for me, photographs are documentation but also sketchbook. And I think kind of the persistence of working with that all along as well has been something that's just in that constant evolving of manipulation, darkness, illumination, and of course these spaces and telling their stories. Yeah. It's all my photography, minus the one that I think I credited to Wes, which is one of my favorite photos actually. Wes Ferry!
So, flashback to 2003.
You'd be sitting here, I'd be sitting here.
Exactly. You're working with aggregates then.
Sure.
How to fill spaces. And you've always kind of gone towards that. And can you talk more about your interest in that?
Yeah, I think that's something I'm still trying to unpack. I don't know why it's something that for me, there's the nuances with the intricacy of many, many parts. I constantly always say, I'm going to try to do something that's like really minimal and just a few pieces. And maybe that's where the work has slowly become less and less pieces and more kind of minimal drawings in space. But I think it's a really loaded question, actually. No, I think for me, aggregation also allows for more anomalies and nuance. And I think if there's the kind of aggregate of many pieces, they each start to have a role and a character to add up to a sum, but if you were really sort of particular and specific and obsessive about something, you start to realize when the system has alterations to respond to a human occupant or a type of material change. So for me, it's not necessarily repeating many of the same parts, it's like the family of the system and being able to tell more of a story because of how I've manipulated the different pieces. I wish it wasn't the case sometimes because so many parts is hard. But
It's awesome.
thank you.
Katie, you had very interesting formulations. I was really curious what sort of logbooks or studio books or exploration record that you keep. But there's one phrase that came where you said, so I'm doing something and then suddenly an instinct and an interest emerges. I was quite taken by instinct and interest that emerge out of the experience.
That's how I feel like I experience the things. I know I always try to stay very true to not knowing what I'm doing the whole time, being nimble and observant. A lot of times I finish projects and I realize, oh, I did that, that's what happened. And I think for me it's being constantly aware of what each decision is doing. And maybe the illumination, darkness, and material kind of all comes together and it's also, I don't have a lot of drawings. For me, it's that hand-on making, it's literally making it, and so the logbooks are all over the place in terms of what they are, but maybe the fact that it isn't hard on drawings allows me to have that instinct and interest that goes away and just comes through trying to relate to the pieces as they are on a site. Lane?
Katie, I have a question for you. Remember talking to you earlier last winter about the work in Detroit and you telling me about darkness, and it was really fascinating to me about how that inspired you. And it's clear that the Academy inspired you in the same way, and the catacombs, and Rome is a dark city, by the way.
It is.
So I could see that analogy right away. And my question is this: I wonder now that you clearly those places form a very definite impression and an inspiration for each one of these things. is there a greater thing, is there something else in Rome that you've already, is there thoughts about the eternal city, about the history of Rome, about the longer, not just the effect you see right now, but the whole philosophical endeavor of Rome and how that might influence them?
I do know something that really struck me, and maybe it's more of a result of that long endeavor. Of course, Rome being lots of fragments, I think was always interesting to me. And I think if you look at the photos I took, in a way I started to make fragments out of places that weren't necessarily in the fragmentation anymore. And so I was really interested in Rome for the kind of imagination of what wasn't there.
Yeah.
So the pieces would then give you something that you could place into those. And darkness, of course, pairs to that. And so I think it has a lot to do with the kind of history and longevity that gives you all those stories that I didn't know what was happening. And as somebody who hadn't really studied that city very intensely before, wanting to experience it in the kind of now situation, but for all of those kind of moments as their own, I get to give them a story, I guess, especially when they fall into darkness. And I think I was trying to I was basically trying to erase Rome in the darkness, like making more and more fragments as it went.
I think you said the key word, fragments. It
Yeah.
seems to sum it all up with Rome. That's wonderful work.
Thank you.
So, Catie, a beautiful work. It's really a treat to see. I almost feel like a Philistine asking a question about architecture and buildings in after this. But I am really struck. I'm sort of reminded of Boulez at one point describing architecture, especially the architecture of mourning as an architecture of shadows, and that he describes at one point that he was simply trying to build shadows. He was not trying to build the work. And it seems to me like so much of what you're doing is making light visible and material, making the darkness visible and material. But I'm wondering that. So I'd love to see what are your studios making? Where does this come back around into buildings for you, or do you sort of say buildings are one thing, these projects are not buildings, these are something that I do in buildings, or how do you think about buildings and this work?
For me, I think it's always maybe backing up a little bit to the phrase of architecture as opposed to buildings, but I actually see this work. So I see the kind of, there's a faster cadence to this work instead of doing a full building. I actually see the cadence of something as installation of material scale, being able to take on different conversations of the architectural discourse that we can't necessarily through an entire building. And you'll see particularly among, I'd say, the once residents, all the house projects, that allows me actually to give a commentary on the very current issues that are happening, but I think actually buildings are too slow to do that. When it comes though to making buildings, I would say, which I particularly enjoy very small spaces and spaces that I can literally be part of building exactly as they are. And I think some of it for me is actually, this is the way I design, this is the way I make. So I think Alibi Studio is moving more, hopefully continuing to use installation materials research, but moving more towards also the making of very small spaces that we're able to take kind of the material and illumination obsession into spaces. And I think it's actually, I honestly feel like it's more effective at a small scale. So I don't know if it's becoming something that's going to grow over time, but I would honestly say for me it's actually more important to be true to a space and a project than to go through the kind of question, is this a full building or not a full building? It sort of, is this the full story, is what I'm always after first. If that's the question. Did you still have a question?
You answered it.
Okay. Are there other unanswered questions?
Maybe answer them upstairs.
I can answer them upstairs. I'd love to. Thanks.